Good evening, fellow beekeepers. Welcome to this BIBBA webinar, and welcome to our speaker this evening, Karl Colyer.
Mhm.
Before I go much further, I'd better state that if you want to ask a question, please do so, but in the chat at the bottom of the screen. And then at the end, I will ask Karl the questions. So this evening's speaker is Karl Colyer. He's been keeping bees for over 20 years. Keeps bees in uh, Cheshire, semi-commercial. I've worked with Karl quite a bit, and I like his approach because it's a different sort of approach than most beekeepers are subjected to. And his title this evening is really aimed at those in the first 5 years, which I think is quite vulnerable. Beekeepers in that area are quite vulnerable because they do need to move on, and sometimes they're not perhaps given the help and encouragement that they should. So, without any more from me, I'll just ask Carl to take on from here. So, the first 5 years, please, Carl. Thank you very
Br-
much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Roger. I'll just go straight to the share screen and hopefully get going and start. And let's just go. So hopefully you can see that okay. Silence, right. I'll take silence as confirmation.
No, in that case, I'll come back. Yes, I can hear you, Carl. It's okay.
Right. And you can see the screen.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Everything. Yep.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Although the title says getting through the first 5 years, one of the things I've learned is that it's actually quite hard work to get through the 5 years. And even after 5 years, many beekeepers haven't got through the first 5 years. I'll talk more about that later. But beyond the sort of basic exams and assessment and learning that you get, my view is that there's a bit of a void. And you can choose to go through learning the modules of the BBKA, fantastic. But also you just sort of need to get on with your practical beekeeping as well. It's like trying to pass a driving test, then learning to drive. So, as Roger said, been keeping bees about 20 years. Had sort of bumbling around between 60 and 100 colonies, but I do like making lots of colonies. So, uh, rearing queens, making nukes is an absolute joy. And I have people sponsoring some of the hives. I have hives 22 places in Cheshire, but I do have them as far away as Kent, and I live in Cheshire, so it's a bit of a trek, but it's a good excuse to go and visit my mum. I don't know if you've heard the saying that 80% of beekeepers don't make it through the first 5 years. I believe that to be broadly true. I do see that the BBKA has lots of new members each year, but the overall membership doesn't really increase. So there's a sort of turnover or churn. And I have mentored people up to 12 at a time, sort of one-to-one, face-to-face, but also via WhatsApp, had a group of up to 55 people that I mentored. It's quite hard work, but one of the things that I did notice that the questions were quite common and just genuine. It's the practicalities of beekeeping. I did give up beekeeping for a few months around when we had those very bad winters. I can't remember when it was, 2012 or something, but it was -17 and they died, and I didn't understand why. I thought I'd failed the bees in some way. So it happens to all of us. But what I want to do is just take it through. Now, there are two journeys to talk about tonight. One is the beekeeper, who is going through the first 5 years of beekeeping. And just be aware, slight spoiler alert, even if you've been keeping bees for 10 years, you may find that you aren't what I deem to be through the 5 year journey. And the trick here is not to go around the first sort of few years, year after year. But the other side of it is the colony. Now, I can say I've been keeping bees 20 years, but I've got loads of colonies that are just going through their first winter, plenty going through their second winter, plenty going through their third, and so on. So it's a whole sort of cycle that we're going through. For the beekeeper, it's an evolving situation as the years go on. But for the bees, it's a revolving situation. As you requeen or they supersede or swarm, they do it themselves for you. So the whole process starts again. Okay. Now, 5 years means different things to different people. If you do simple beekeeping and you just keep doing the same thing year after year, I think you've had 1 year's experience 5 times. And it may sound a bit blunt. I don't mean it to sound critical, but it's a trap we can fall into because it's comfortable. Similarly, if you've got a couple of hives and you go through an evolution and for 5 years, for me, you've sort of got 10 hive years worth of experience. That's good, brilliant. But the more hives you get over the more years, so much the better. I know when I was bubbling around 100 hives, so each year I thought I was getting 100 hive years worth of experience. But as Roger said, we've sort of worked together, and I've had the pleasure of going around to see other people's bees around the UK, and it's fascinating just to see what goes on. But the learning journey is continuous. The picture on the right is me chainsawing a colony of free living bees out of a tree. This is 35 feet up next to a shopping centre. The road has been closed. I've got an hour to rescue those bees. So I'm not saying that that's part of the 5 year journey, but if you keep going on a sort of continuous learning, it takes you up all sorts of avenues. Now, there's a fair amount that I want to touch on tonight. It's not a how-to guide, it's a what-to consider guide. But there's quite a few sections here to go through. So we'll have a go through it and breathe. Okay, we'll jump straight in. You'll notice straight away, year zero is before you get your bees. Okay, so in terms of equipment, it would be useful to have a good idea of what equipment to get. And we know whether to choose Nationals or Langstroths. You'll make your choices between poly and wood hives. It's your choice. It doesn't really matter either way. But once you start going down a route, I do recommend you stick with that route and try 1 or 2 hives in the first year. And if you can in the second year, maybe you've got a nuke box that the bees were delivered in, but have a go at raising a nuke. And get the second hive filled up. You probably need a few jars. Later on, we'll talk about bait boxes, extractor bits, and more frames by the third year. And eventually, you might want to consider more hives, even just buying more equipment to raise your own queens. And then by the 5th year onwards, because hopefully there's a little bit of a surplus for possibly bees, but hopefully almost certainly honey, you'll start needing some jars and bits of equipment and so on. Now, the key point here is if you are going to choose the type of hive, please try to stick with it. I say that through experience because I didn't do that. And even if you choose, right, I'll go for a national wooden hive, that's fine. Just be aware that if you get it from a certain supplier, that's great. If you get it from a different supplier, it may be slightly different sizes and you find things may not fit as well. So this is my apiary at home a few years ago, actually. I like the bright colors, so do the bees, but I've got Langstroth hives that sort of a front center. And then there's some national hives. You might see some with different adapter plates on where I'm trying to get a national converted to a Langstroth and vice versa. I've got mini nukes. Probably where I ended up is the pile of pallets by the tree ended up becoming my next set of hives, and I just gave up buying them because they were too expensive once you get past 30 or 40. So started making them from scratch. So in terms of equipment, standardize, it makes it much simpler. And obviously you need to get bees. Now you can decide what bees to get. And there's a few on the market. If you believe the adverts, then the more money they spend on advertising, the better the bees. Not necessarily true. The more money there is behind selling bees, then the more it gets pushed. Probably the best bees for you are already in your area. And for me, those, I would call them locally adapted bees, but they're local bees for local beekeepers. If you want to get some bees in from elsewhere, that's your decision. but the chances are they won't necessarily just fit into your locality and whatever genetic pool you've got there. So what will happen is, as they go through future queen rearing cycles, the genetics starts to wobble a little bit. And what I don't want people to see is big changes in the nature of their bees. So if you can get local bees, so much the better. Going on from that, you've got to go through the scary process, but also excited at the same time of splitting your colony. Got to have a go. Try to avoid buying more nukes. If you're splitting the colony, one of the things that is a key feature of that is they will breed with the local drones. So that just again enhances the sort of locally adapted nature. You may find as well you can get bees for free by having a bait box. The BBKA is having some fantastic articles this year written by a guy called Karl Colyer. That I recommend him highly, called In the Workshop. And the April one is to do with making your own bait hive. And it's cheap as chips. It may cost you less than £1 to make it, but that way you can get free bees. They could be bees from the local area, from obviously other beekeepers, because your bees never swarm, but they could also be free living bees. So bees from local colonies living in trees or cavities somewhere, which are usually pretty robust and worth a good look, because there could be some very hardy genetics there, very well locally adapted. Going on from sort of year 3, 4 onwards, have a go at raising some nukes, but also have a go at overwintering a nuke. For me, a cardinal sin is to have a nuke box that's empty, even in December. And you should be looking to raise 2 or 3, possibly 4 nukes in a box during the course of the year. And you may think, hang on, I'm not really into producing queens, but all you're doing is making a few more bees. And if they're surplus to your requirements, then please just share them locally and keep those local bees nice and local. It's a good way to stop other people having to purchase bees and bring them into the area and disrupt your bees. Going onwards as well, I said year 5 here, but hopefully you can get into a routine where you are making a surplus of bees and you can assess your bees and decide which ones are the best ones for you. And you might want to choose a few criteria, whether it's gentle or hardy or productive. And the ones that are best for you, then just keep copying those. It sounds simple, but it's a process to go through. Quite a lot of people don't make it down towards the bottom of the list, and I think it's a missed opportunity. Uh, I don't buy bees, and I can't really remember the last time I bought some bees, but it was probably 400 or so colonies ago. No idea. But your locally adapted and locally supplied bees are probably best for your area. Just try to remember that. For me, this is what good looks like. It's not a wall-to-wall brood colony. That just tells me they're overcrowding and possibly at risk of swarming. But it's where you've got a good mix of sort of seal brood and larvae and so on. But around the outside, you've got the pollen and the nectar and the honey. Uh, for me, that looks like the sort of perfect colony where it's in balance. Almost all of my colonies run on single brew box. There are a few I choose to run on a double brew box, but only because it helps me split the colonies into 2. Just it's one way of doing simple splits, but we'll talk about that later. I guess it's drilled into you that you have to do inspections. I agree. It's absolutely essential, partly because if you got 3 or 4 colonies, eventually it becomes a big memory test about what's going on. And you may remember what's happening with your colony, but what happened this time last year or the year before? Is it consistent? Is it different? If you have a good run of warm weather, expect a few things to pull forward. The swarm risk might come a bit earlier, and so on. So get a record card from somewhere. You can get it from anywhere. You'll notice there's a record card up on the BIBBA website. Always worth a look. You can adapt it to suit your own needs, but please feel free to get a record card from wherever you like. It really doesn't matter as long as you get into the routine of inspecting regularly and making some notes. Now, the first year's notes might be a bit haphazard. You won't necessarily spot everything, and you won't necessarily be writing things down in any form other than longhand. But it will be useful later on because it gives you information. Later on, you can use that to increase your knowledge, and that will help your decision making. The idea of the inspections is to help contain swarms, manage swarms in whichever way you choose, but also to manage disease, the risk of disease. It really is a case of inspecting as few times as you need to, but as many times as you have to. Early doors, you'll be inspecting probably too frequently and spending far too long with the hive open. Okay, it's not so brilliant for the bees, but it's the pace that you're doing things at. You're becoming competent at what you do, but it takes a little while. Eventually, it'll come more naturally. And when you are inspecting, you'll be observing and trying to make notes, but eventually, certainly by the second, third year, you'll be starting to understand what's going on. And I mean, you'll pick it up. You'll know some days you go into your bees and they're a bit sporty and spiky and coming up. For me, there's different levels with my bees. If I gently open up the brew box and look in, and they're all fine, that's lovely. Everything's calm, and on a nice sunny day when there's lots of nectar coming in, that's great. If there isn't much nectar around, the colony is crowded with flying bees, which have got their sting fully mature and ready to receive any unwanted guests and intruders. But just observe your bees, understand them, and when eventually also start to compare what's happening at the hive entrance as to what's happening inside. And that way you won't hopefully have to inspect quite so frequently inside the hive. I heard a saying, I say it a lot, every time you open up the hive, it costs a jar of honey. And that's in terms of heat lost and moisture lost. It doesn't take long to get that moisture and heat back, but the bees have to repropelize all the gaps up, and all the time they're doing that is diverting away from nectar collection, which is the main sort of constituent of honey. When you do get to inspect the bees and understand them, you can actually predict what's going on next, and you can look at a colony and think, I'm going to need to do something with this colony in the next week or two. Or actually, this looks absolutely fine. I can leave this for 3 or 4 weeks. It takes time, but you will be able to have an inspection and make decisions on that. Now, yeah, here we go. Most of my inspections happen at the entrance. I'm lucky enough to have several apiaries, but when I walk up to an apiary, there might be, for example, 6 hives there, and I'll notice a couple of them are acting differently at the entrance, and those would be the two I like to look at. One might not be very busy, and the other one just might be bearding or something. So I'd be interested to peep into those ones first. If you've only got one hive, well, good luck. For me, it's like playing roulette and putting all of your chips on red or black each time. Yeah, as long as that colony survives winter, brilliant. But if you've got a second hive and you lose one, you can always split in the following spring to get your numbers back. If you've got two hives and a nuke, so much the better, because you can overwinter a nuke. And as Roger said to me before, and again, you just pick up things and it's just fascinating because they stick with you forever. The best time to replace your winter losses is before they happen. So if you've got 2 hives and a nuke, you can go into winter with 3 colonies. If one dies out, you can put it in, you reserve one in the spring. If none of them die out, then you've actually got a nuke you can put towards auction or to sell in spring when they're most in demand. For me, this is the favorite place to do an inspection. You see the pollen coming in. There's no deformed wing virus. There's no fighting or robbing going on. Everybody's happy. Lovely. That's as good as it gets. Now, one of the things I get asked about quite a lot is honey, and it's all too easy to think that honey in the hive is made for you rather than for the bees. So I ask people from the off to be realistic about their expectations. I tend to keep it nice and simple. In the first year, either have one frame or half a dozen jars of honey as a sensible maximum. The bees need to have the priority. They'll have spent a lot of time drawing out their wax comb, and that takes a tremendous amount of effort. As far as I understand, the numbers aren't always firm, but it takes about 6 times as much effort to draw out a comb as it does to fill that comb with honey. So big investment with the bees to make all that wax and then try to fill the comb with nectar to make into honey. And for you to take any more than just the bare minimum in the first year, I think is a little harsh on the bees. If you find you're having to feed the bees, you're probably wanting to take too much. From the second year onwards, I just have this mantra certainly with early years people, the first super of honey is for the bees, and that just keeps it nice and simple. That takes away the risk of starvation over the winter. It is possible for the bees to easily, if they're locally adapted, easily sort of survive the winter on a single brew box and nothing else. So in amongst that brew box will be all the bees clustered together and enough honey to get them through the winter. However, we're still learning about our bees. We're also still learning about our beekeeping. So second year, second year, yeah, first super for the bees. Beyond that, you can start to get curious and inquisitive about what's going on in the area. Who else has got a honey crop that the winter declared? But a big health warning here. Those that have got a pretty crappy honey crop don't really advertise it too highly. It's only the people that have got a bounty of honey. So if you're asking who's got what sort of honey crop you got, those people that got the biggest honey crops will tend to shout loudest, and it does distort the figures just a little bit. So useful to take a fairly pragmatic view on that. But I'm hoping as well that your beekeeping will evolve. One of the most exciting things that I got into was, for example, just waiting for the blackberries to come into flower, and I would harvest a super of honey or as many frames as I reasonably could, just as the blackberry flowers were coming into full bloom, and then I'd put those frames back into the supers and allow them to be there while the blackberries are in full bloom. And for me, I'm pretty convinced that a good chunk of that will be blackberry honey. And when you can do that, if there's some lime going on, or in my area, I've got Himalayan balsam, you can get a whole series of different honeys which have got different colors, different textures, different tastes. Although I can't really tell the difference between the tastes myself. I'm not very good at wine tasting or honey tasting, but it just feels like you're more in tune with the crops, with the bees, and with the absolute wonder of nature. So taking crops for different forage, brilliant. But you also then start to realize that the thing about honey is it does attract friends and family. So you may end up finding that you start giving quite a lot of the honey away, and you attract even more friends that way. Sometimes friends can be worse than wasps for robbing your honey stores, but all you need to do is extract it and jar it, and you'll find these people appear. Hopefully, once the colonies have moved on, you'll be getting a fair amount of surplus honey from each of your hives, and then you'll end up with a slightly new problem, how to store your excess honey. For me, I store them in buckets. There's the 32-pound sort of honey bucket, which is fairly standard, and I think I've got about 30 buckets in my honey studio, I call it. And that's enough just to get me through to May or June, when I can start taking off some early crops of honey from this year. Okay, so for me, the first super of honey is for the bees all the time. Take that as you will. Here's a typical frame. I actually keep my supers and brood boxes the same size. So this is a brood frame, but I make my supers out of brood boxes. For me, it just keeps life simpler. Not recommending it, it's just what I do. For the more observant amongst you as well, this frame is made out of old pallets because it's cheaper, and there's no foundation in there as such. The bees have drawn it out themselves, so that to be as good as it gets. I'm always keen to point out the holes at the sort of corners of the comb because that's what the bees naturally want to do. I see it in free living bees in trees and buildings, but if we put a whole sheet of wax foundation in, it tends to make it wall to wall, and they seem to miss out on the things that they naturally want to build. Comes the topic of feeding. I think feeding is sensible while you are learning and while the bees are very young. But beyond that, I'm hoping that your bees are in balance with your environment and don't require feeding. So you'll have a view on feeding. We know sugar water is basically the mainstay. You can buy some more exotic stuff and you can buy it ready mixed, but sugar and water is nice and simple. And there'll be debates about 1-to-1 feeding and 2-to-1. That's absolutely fine. I can understand some of the sort of timings and that. You don't need to sweat too much about it. But 1-to-1 is quite useful for pretty much all the time, except as it's starting to come to autumn. And then if you can put more sugar in to make it like a 2-to-1, it saves the bees some effort of having to evaporate off all that water, if that's your thing. Now, by feeding sugar water early doors, you're not creating sugar honey, as I would call it. You're giving them resources, energy, so that they can exude the wax and make the comb. So you can convert sugar into wax for those early sort of few months, early season or so. And it's very, very useful to do that. Once they start to draw it out and they start to fill up, hopefully as well with a good nectar flow, they should be self-sustaining, and you'll see them flying off and bringing pollen, and you can't see that they're bringing nectar back unless you're fairly attuned and seeing they flying back with their sort of backsides down, sort of tail heavy because they're fairly full, but it takes a little bit to get used to that. As your first and second year goes on, syrup in the winter. Syrup in the summer, again, just to draw out the comb and give them some essential feed, so it's your security, but then fondant in the winter. And I'm sure you've seen the pack. You cut the X at the top and then just slap the pack on top. If you cut the writing side, then the nice clear side is on top, and you just keep peeping in by lifting off the roof. And if you can see bees, you know you've got about 3 or 4 weeks before they're going to run out of stores completely. So if you see the fondant is starting to go and it's March, like now, not a problem really. In my area in Cheshire, the dandelions come out around about the 1st of April, and that's a supply of nectar and pollen. So just need to get them through to April Fool's Day. If you notice from year 2, I'm trying to avoid summer feeding, but keep the winter fondant on because that's an insurance policy. In years 3 and 4, if you can avoid any feeding onwards, that's absolutely brilliant. And you could keep like that all the way through. One of the sort of purposes of using some selective feeding later on is stimulative feeding of some hive. If you've got bees that you think are good for rearing some queens from, you can give them some syrup a little bit earlier. I've got 7 hives that I give them some sugar water to and pollen patty. And what I've done there is effectively simulate the start of a nectar and pollen flow, which then stimulates the queen to start laying. So the colony will start to build up. Hopefully, she'll also be laying some drones, and I'm going to start to get some early opportunities to do some queen rearing. Now, it may only be a few days or so, but it gives me some comfort that I'm trying to decide which bees I would like to do my bee improvement program from for 2024, and I'm just giving them a nice head start. If we go and get a beast from the east and so on, at least we know we've got some reserves in there and some way for them to carry on and not suffer. So ultimately, if you can have colonies that don't require any feeding, then I think you've got a colony that is sort of sustainable and in sort of balance with the local ecology. Again, I use the words locally adapted bees. This is one of my feeders. It's a Nutella jar. My daughter helps me with the Nutella jars by emptying them for me, but that's quite a costly way of doing it. I did find down at the artisan market, the local crepe man has loads of these jars. And if you're like me, there's enough scrag ends of Nutella in them, once you've scraped around 15 or 20 of them, to fill up a whole Nutella jar. So why do I use these? Well, first of all, they're free. And also, it's a limited amount of feed. But for me, they're absolutely perfect because I can see if they're drawing the syrup down. The clear glass is absolutely perfect. If I'm doing a split raisin and nuke, I'll quite often put one of those on, which is about a pint or so of syrup. And if they take it down, that's pretty much all they get. If they don't take it down, it tells me they're getting enough resources from their environment anyway, with the natural nectar and pollen supply, which I'm very happy with. Everyone will start to talk about swarms. It's a nemesis of some beekeepers. Many beekeepers will think that their bees have never swarmed. They just don't realize that they swarmed. It's a very natural process. And so just understand it's entirely natural. In some ways, it's quite hard to stop. But the top tip always is to give space for the brood. If you've got some very prolific bees and they're advertised as making lots and lots of honey, that's great. But the way they do it is they make a copious amount of bees, you use up masses of resources to do it, and they can make you have a good honey crop, but they will be devouring resources from around the area. The downside of having what we would generally call prolific bees is that they can starve. Even in the summer, if we have a bit of a gap in sort of June, a nectar dearth, they could easily find that they are trying desperately to feed a very large population of larvae, and they just don't have the stocks in place. And I've seen bees that are having to be fed syrup in June and July, which is not normal. It's not sustainable that way. So give space for the brood. If you confine the brood to a small space, then it will overcrowd. The queen then's got nowhere to lay, and the bees will think she's ailing or failing because her pheromone levels change and there's not so many eggs. So they will want to replace her, and a natural process is either swarming or, depending on the time of year, supersedure. If you do have quite a lot of brood there, you can put another box on if needed, and that will allay some of your fears, but always try to question why they need to live in more than one box. For me, I would hope that it would be better to take 2 or 3 frames of eggs and larvae out, maybe some sealed brood, maybe some food, and put them into a box, be it a nute box or another brood box with a bit of packing in the side, and you're going through the process of artificial swarming. It's one then that means it's both predictable for you and it prevents swarming in most cases. Once you get over that hurdle of trying 1 or 2, and never please expect 100% success rate. If you've got a 60 or 80% success rate, that's plenty good enough. Life is a bit of hit and miss. It's a bit like trying to throw darts and get 180 every time. Okay, even the world-class players struggle to do that. So with nature and with normal variations, be it the weather, competition, the way the queen is born, if she's born imperfectly, maybe with slightly deformed wing, then things aren't going to happen, and you'll end up having a queenless colony or a badly fertilized queen, whatever it is. Yeah, this happens from time to time. So never give up if it doesn't work first time. Come year 3, though, I wouldn't mind you thinking about scheduling more than one split. Maybe I'm going to try for 2 splits. For me, I do them every 3 weeks. So I do one sort of early to mid-May, depending on the weather, and that acts as a swarm prevention, but it gives me colony increase. And then in the sort of early June, I'll have a go at another one, and then around about 1st of July, I will do normally what would be my last split. The reason I do it then is literally because it's a bit of a time, sort of 30, 40 days plus for the queen to be raised and mature and then mate and start laying. And they've got to go through the whole cycle then of getting some comb, getting some nectar, make it into the honey, and trying to get through the first year. So for me, 1st of July, maybe mid-July is as late as I dare do it up in Cheshire. If you're lucky enough to live down the southern end of the country, you might be able to gain another week or two, another cycle or two even. As time goes on, rather than do splits as per the calendar, you're doing splits as per resource availability. And this is to do with pollen and nectar. There's not a lot of point doing splits if there's no food available. You end up then possibly having to contemplate feed them sugar water, which sort of then negates the whole point of trying to keep the process as natural as possible. But the ultimate game and intent is to have your queens from your bees and raised as naturally as you can. It takes time. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. But a bottom line with swarms, and certainly early doors, if you can get your first queen and it's clipped, or you can get someone to clip the queen's wings on one side, it pretty much is a lifesaver. You don't lose your bees or half your bees to a swarm. You don't upset your neighbors. Okay, they may all go pouring out because it's a swarm, but they all come back. And worst case scenario, you'll end up with a queen on the ground surrounded by a few bees. If you find her, brilliant. You can pick her up and put her into a nuke and away you go again. But you end up with all your bees and quite a few swarm cells, so you can just do a few splits of your own right there and then if you want to. Having a clipped queen isn't harmful to the queen, and it gives you masses of flexibility and quite a lot of comfort about managing the swarm risk. To be clear, my bees swarm a lot, but it's because I create the swarm situation. I do want to crowd them. I do create artificial swarms. So that's part of my queen rearing cycle. And I have been caught out where I want them to raise natural queen cells quite often. And if I'm away for a day or two, then they'll swarm. And it's predictable. When the queen cells get sealed over, yeah, good luck from then onwards. So here's some swarms. That's what they look like in the picture book. The right-hand picture, for those that have got eagle eyes, that's a bush next to my apiary where I do my queen rearing. There's actually 3 swarms in that picture. The sort of big one in the middle, one above it, and then one down on the horizontal post down below. That's when I came back from doing a 4-day training course, which was originally intended to be 2, but they were 2 days, but they were too popular. And so I knew the timing was slightly off. Now I've learnt my lesson, so I've got some bait boxes in that position now. We talked about frames. There will be frames of different sizes, and you'll learn the National Brood and National Super and Langstroths and so on. And then there's commercials and 14 by 12s, all sorts of different frame sizes. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. It doesn't really matter, other than just please understand what goes on. But once you've sort of understood, choose one. I don't mind which one you choose, but a very popular one is the national size. I believe about 95% of people have that. So it's easy to get, fairly good sort of cost because it's mass produced, and it's the sort of standard availability for foundation and the like. You will need to get your own frames. I would very much recommend that you assemble your own frames. Excuse me. You can buy them, and some people do choose to buy them, but sorry, excuse me. But you will have to start assembling your frames at some point. So earlier the better. One of the top tips I always learn is try to make your spare frames up before you first swarm. I've been there where your bees are swarming and you're frantically trying to cobble together some frames, squeeze some foundation in without ripping it, and get 6 as quick as you can because you're trying to get the bees from the tree into that box. It doesn't work. So ideally, you have a box full of super frames and a box full of brood frames in the box, always available. Just keep them out the sunlight and uh, just cycle them through. I think that's quite essential. After the second, certainly the third year, and in the brood box, where the bees would have gone through quite a few cycles of raising brood, they will have the sort of chrysalis case on the inside and it'll be polished and the comb will be getting darker and darker. There's a couple of ways around sort of managing this. One is to move the slightly darker combs towards the outside of the box. The other one is to replace them. And if you've got, let's say, 4 colonies, then ideally you'd be replacing, say, 3 or so frames each year on a regular basis from each colony. So it just means buying a dozen frames and then putting 3 in each colony and keeping the whole thing cycling through. It's just a routine to get into. It's not the end of the world if you skip a year or even 2, but it's not doing the bees many favors. Now, it does cost money for the frames and the foundation, but you can try to use some sort of slightly cheaper routes. You've probably heard of foundation strips at the top. You can even go completely foundationless and let the bees draw the comb out themselves. The only thing about that is give some thought about how you want the comb to be reinforced. We use sort of wired foundation, it's embedded in, but you can use fishing line or barbecue cocktail sticks if you wish. And a very top tip is your hives need to be level because your bees will just build the comb down vertically. And if your hive's on a slight slant, so all your comb will be. And if you get to the point where you're making your own frames, so much the better. But top tip, always have frames available. For me, and most of the time through the summer, because I've got quite a few hives, I'll be assembling 10 brood frames per day, just on a routine basis. And I find I go chomping through those during the course of the season. Partly if there are swarms, I'm a swarm collector as well, so that brings in a bit of traffic, but partly as well because I'm doing artificial splits, so I just need a regular supply of as much frames and ideally drawn comb, but I next compromise is foundation, but I tend to give them foundationless and get on with it themselves. Here's an example of one of my boxes. It's just slabs of wood I make up. You can see the frames are made out of pallet wood, and I could have plastic frame separators, or I could have castellated spacers, but I just use some roofing clout nails because for some weird reason they're just the right size. So, I mean, we'll know that typically round about a pound for a frame and a pound for the foundation. In my perfect hive setup, I would have 300 colonies, which is a scary amount, which means 10,000 frames. So that's a £20,000 bill for the frames and foundation. But these frames cost 2p each. So rather than have a £20,000 hit, it's a £200 hit. It's suddenly very manageable. People will talk about disease, and it is a daunting subject area, but it's actually quite simple if you take it logically. Please appreciate that bees get diseases, and some of them are notifiable. There's 5 altogether, including Varroa, which came in, I think, when we left the EU, but that's more a quirk of the system as opposed to something that's important to notify. But appreciate that bees get diseases. Top tip, though, is that the important ones you'll hear are European foul brood and American foul brood. Of the two, the chances are very slim, but you could experience EFB in your beekeeping career. So my top tip is to learn how to identify, recognize potential EFB. If you can do that in your first year, that's good enough. Now, for some people, they'll say you'll need to learn about all the other diseases, but I want you to see and recognize the notifiable diseases first. In the second year, AFB, again, you'll almost certainly never encounter it in your lifetime. I hope no one encounters it, but life is different. Occasionally, there's some people that draw the short straw. But come the third year, if you're able to understand what chalk brood and sac brood and so on looks like, uh, if you want to get into things like nosema and understand the symptoms of it, that's perfect. And the more you can get comfortable with recognizing disease, the better. Now, ideally, you'd be learning how to inspect for diseases from year 1 or 2, but trust me, even after year 5, I see people, I don't think they would recognize the diseases because they're just not looking for them. Or if they see them, they don't actually see them for what they are. They just see it as different. Okay. But you'll get to the point where regular monitoring is just part of your routine. If you get into a regime where you say it's the first inspection of the year and the last inspection of the year, that's okay. That's what many of the sort of people recommend, but there's no harm in have when you take a frame out of a colony, just look at some of the unsealed brood, which is where you're likely to see the EFB, and some of the sealed brood where you're likely to see the AFB. And then just look for anything else that's different, and you might be able to spot some of the other uh, less severe diseases and things going on. So if you are in doubt at all, take a photograph, and you can always show it to someone and say, should I be worried about this? If people look at it and say, yes, you should be worried, then you can go on and get more people involved. If they say, no, that's such and such, then it gives you some comfort. But be mindful to ask somebody with a bit of experience, and by all means, get a second or third opinion. You're learning, and some people will want to give you an air of confidence. But again, many diseases aren't easily recognized, so best you learn it on your own. For me, I've got pictures on my phone of the diseases. EFB and AFB are just memory tests for me because I don't see it in real life. I just see it on the disease courses I go on and in videos. So I always make sure I've got photographs and a video of each of them. Okay. Varroa, tough one. It's been around for 30 odd years now. I'm hoping it won't be a significant issue in 10 years' time. But to do that, we need to work as a sort of country to deal with it. You will hear of people that are just stop giving treatments and go cold turkey and let the bees get on with it. Very often they'll suffer some quite heavy losses, but the bees that get through that lot are survivor bees, and there's something to be said for that. But it's a very brutal way of trying to get better bees. So by all means, early doors, follow the book. Do regular treatments, follow the instructions. There's no harm in doing that. The only downside to doing that is if you've got bees which are really useless at coping with Varroa, you're keeping them alive and sort of perpetuating those genetics. But we just don't know early doors. Later on, in the second year, rather than just treat it because it's that time of year, you can try to see if they actually are needing a treatment. So regular treatments moves to treat if it's required. You may be able to skip a treatment or delay a treatment, but again, just follow the instructions when you're doing it. From year 3 onwards, by all means, treat as required. You may find you don't have to treat quite so often, and the instructions may say put 2 strips or X milliliters of stuff in. But if it's not a severe issue, or it's not a very large colony, you may not need to put the full amount in. Now, it's a risk to do that, but what you're doing is giving the bees some stress to actually sort the issue out themselves without you doing a chemical intervention and just sort of uh, helping them out, but not really helping them become either resistant or resilient or tolerant of Varroa. We've got containment interventions. Uh, Varroa will naturally want to breed, and the numbers get bigger and bigger during the course of the summer. The only way to break that is to break some of their breeding cycle, and they are looking for sort of fairly large sized larvae that are just about to be sealed over to to be available at all times. So something like a swarm or even an artificial split or even a shook swarm disrupt that whole cycle. What happens is it knocks back the number of Varroa. Now, it's not going to get rid of the Varroa, but it may negate you having to treat for one of the cycles, possibly even two of the sort of past cycles that you would have done in your first year. It's up to you. The more you learn about Varroa and what you can do in terms of natural methods to contain Varroa numbers, then the fewer other interventions, the chemical interventions you'll need to do. The ultimate aim is to seek treatment-free beekeeping. Now, it's early doors on this, but it could all be happening in 10 years' time. There's good information being made available. Professor Stephen Martin is talking about how the bees will unseal and reseal the caps. Quite difficult to see that that's happening, but with a trained eye, it gives you an early indication. If you see what we would have called a pepper pot brood, in the past, we may have seen that as an ailing or failing queen in some way, but it actually may be the bees are learning to do Varroa-sensitive hygiene, and they're opening up some of the cells to try to deal with the infected larvae inside to sort out the Varroa themselves. So it's good news that we're understanding more and more. If we can do it slowly and steadily, the stronger bees and the bees that are able to survive and thrive with Varroa around them without having to be treated will be the ones that we can start to rear more queens from, and that will only just improve the natural resistance or resilience of bees. It's a tough one, but if you've got bees that need a lot of treatments, try to avoid rearing queens from those because all you're doing is perpetuating the problem. We talked about inspections earlier on, but keep records. You can have paper records or electronic records. It's great to have a paper record because it's there at the hive. The only downside is when you get home, you're trying to remember what it said and trying to remember you might have written on there, bring another super, and then it's left at the hive and you forget about it. But I've done that. It doesn't matter if you have paper or electronic, and that may be an age thing with you. The younger people may prefer the electronic and so on, but it's really whatever works for you. You can try both. It just gets a bit confusing. First year, I just say record everything you can. If you notice something, how how many eggs there are, how many larvae, how much of the comb is drawn out properly, whether there's lots of nectar, whether the nectar is in amongst the brood. Just write things down. You won't necessarily understand the implications of it early doors, but it gives you information. Information later on gives you intelligence, which gives you knowledge, which then gives you the understanding. When you are keeping records, and you're noticing things happening, like there may be 6 frames a brood, there may be 8 frames a brood. When it gets to like 10 or 11 frames a brood, you're in trouble because the risk of swarming is very high. So try to understand where to intervene. Normally, I would, in my bees, if it's more than 8 frames a brood, I've definitely got the risk of swarming. But on many of my bees, because I inspect them fairly infrequently, if they've got more than 4 frames a brood, I'll often just take the excess frames out and make a nuke. And that way I can leave them alone for 3 or 4 weeks. The original colony will take its time to recover from taking that many bees out, and the new colony has a 60 or 80% chance of mating naturally, and off you go. Now, when you've got records, so you're inspecting, you're recording, you should get to the point where you're starting to analyze what's going on and trying to figure out what's going on, because the next stage is action or interventions. And when you're doing things, it's great, but then try to note what the outcome was. Did it work? If it worked, great. If it didn't work, that's absolutely fine as well, as long as you learn from it. If you keep repeating the mistakes, then it's a problem that's not being solved. But for me, almost all of my learning is by making mistakes and then realizing what I've done. It's the fastest way I find of learning, so I give it a go. And if it works, that's great. But then my learning sort of stops. If it doesn't work, then I look more and more deeply into things. Eventually, I hope your records will start to predict that you can inspect less frequently or perhaps more frequently, depending what's going on. And so you'll start to notice then when things are different, when there's exceptions or outliers, call it what you want, when there's something unusual happening, your records will highlight that and start to tell you to inspect at a different frequency, or more importantly, to do something, to intervene in some way. Okay. Uh, Back in industry, I come from the automotive sector. Inspect, record, analyze, act. If one of those is missing, don't bother with the other three. That's what I was always told. So why do you inspect if it's not recorded? If you inspect and record something, analyze the results. If you're analyzing results, get some kind of action in place. If you find there's no action required, then the inspection, the recording, the analysis is ultimately a waste of time. But you'll learn what the right frequency is over time. Okay. This is one of my inspection sheets I use when I'm teaching people. It's a full-on one. You'll notice 12 columns, and that represents the 12 combs. The one down at the bottom is a bit taller because that's a brew box, and the next two bunches above that are the supers. Looking down the left-hand side of some of these letters, we've got F for foundation, C for drawn comb, N for nectar, H for honey, O for open brood, S for seal brood, P for pollen, and D for drones. Too much detail on here, but it's brilliant if you want to try to recognize what's in your hive. And because you do it for each frame, there's 12 frames, it's actually 24 sides. It gives you quite a lot of information. It's far too detailed for a normal one, but for a beginner to go through it end to end, it is thoroughly enjoyable because you get a snapshot of what's happening in your hive. But if you can get your record cards so they're down to one line, so much the better. Now, we've talked about having your bees and locally adapted and everything, and having your honey and trying to get your varroa levels sorted out, managing the diseases and so on. Part of all of this process is an overall umbrella of bee improvement. And it's not something that I think is discussed enough, because the best bees for your area are almost certainly already in your area. However, try to understand what you want from your bees and how your bees are behaving. They need to ideally just be in balance with the local environment. And if they are able to breed true, so if you rear offspring and they behave in a similar way, so much the better. And so it will be important to be able to replicate your bees, whether it's through artificial swarming or almost let in the swarm and hoping you can catch them, but try to manage it, because you've got a duty of care with all your neighbours. But but find a way to replicate your bees. Some of your bees you will find are better than others, and it's up to you how you judge them. I mentioned three, which just simple ones for me. Are they gentle? Are they hardy? And are they productive? Those are the sort of three basic ones for me. If I find they tick those boxes, then I would want more of those. So those tend to be the ones that I replicate. By doing that and making more queens of that sort of style, not all of them turn out the same way, by the way. Many of them are the same. Some are not so good. Some are even better, which is the whole sort of principle of bee improvement, where you're trying to do incremental improvements, and that works, and that brings your average up. The flip side of that is you will have some bees that probably pretty horrible and or comparatively not nice to have. And another way to increase the average quality of your bees is to get rid of those horrible bees. Pretty much entirely driven by the queen. So replacing that queen with some uh, queen cells from your better stock can start to change that process. If you're brutal, you can squash the queen of your not so nice colonies. I've never enjoyed doing that. It's always felt wrong. However, for the principles of bee improvement and the practices of bee improvement, I can get more of my good bees and fewer of my not so good bees, and the whole process then takes on a nice forward sort of progress step. As a final note, by year 5, and again, there's so many people I see not even doing this. If you've got a good stock, then not only are the bees good-tempered, but the drones carry the lineage as well. So you can get to make more drone comb in those colonies. One of the things I will do is put foundation in. Quite often they draw it down, lots of drone comb, but once it's sealed, I will move it to a colony of my less favorable bees. And what happens then is they just adopt those drones as they're hatched out because they know no different. And the colony seems not to want to make drones of the undesirable bees, but I've got plenty of desirable drones knocking around. Where I've taken them out of my more favorite colonies, they replace them. So I just end up slightly saturating a little bit more of the boy bees, and the girl bees I'll help with grafting or punch cell or whatever method you want to choose for making more bees. So bee improvement is a big subject area. I do wish more people would talk about it. Try to figure out what it is you want. Once you know what you want, look for those characteristics and replicate. And it is literally as simple as that. And it's absolutely delightful to have your bees getting better and better natured and more suitable and in balance, perhaps needing less treatment, perhaps having a stable sort of and predictable honey crop, but also not really needing feeding and not really needing too many inspections because they're just in balance. There's a picture of fact, it's Roger actually, because I recognise the check shirts and braces. But queen rearing days, if you're into that kind of thing, really very, very useful. Uh, people are wanting to raise their own bees, but you've just got to overcome a hurdle. It's actually much simpler than most people realise. Early doors, you will be learning, and it is a lot of information coming in. So before you get your bees year 0, just learn YouTube, but quality is fantastic, but also highly variable. So you need to be mindful. Some of the other stuff will be towards the other end of the spectrum. But understand there's a lot to learn, and the learning curve can appear vertical, certainly in year 1, where most inspections involve a degree of panic and apprehension and trepidation with what's going on, and then not knowing how to deal with something and not having the bits around to deal with it. Don't worry about that. We've all been through that cycle. And when I get new colonies, even though I've been keeping bees 20 years, I need to try to understand how those bees are behaving and what I need to do with them. But your learning curve will continue as long as you allow it to, and there will be the BBKO modules, books to read, people to copy. And I think it's a good sign of respect to copy somebody else rather than try to devise a method yourself. Keep it simple, Keep it local, copy what someone else is doing. Quite often they'll want to show you anyway. I do go to a lot of bee talks. I'm lucky in Cheshire. We've got 5 branches, and there's a wealth of talks. Yeah, there's sort of 12 per year per branch. So I have a look through each year and find ones which I think are going to be interesting to me and useful, and I go to them. Even if I go to a talk I've been to before, I always can find at least 3 things that are worth investigating further, experimenting with. It is quite stunning. If you look, you will find, whether it's inside the hive or within bee talks. I'm hoping, there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 things you might pick up from today, but maybe I'm optimistic on that one. It is important to share your learnings. Tell them about what went well and tell them about what went wrong. I know it may feel awkward because people tend to only want to talk about the positives. It's almost like Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and so on. But life is normal and it'll have its ups and downs. If you're humble enough to talk about things that go wrong, people will often smile at you, but then they'll nod as well because they've been through that really and they know what it's like. We've all been there. It's just we don't always advertise it. We'd rather say our successes. But there will be things that do work well. For me, it's the simplicity of beekeeping. The hardest thing I can do is to make everything simple and to make it dead cheap, and to also understand that if I want to get 12 queens, I would have a go at grafting or whatever method you want to do, but 20 larvae. I should end up with about 12 queens. I would never graft 12 larvae to get 12 queens. I know that's a fluke if that happens. And I can't rely on a fluke. That's just not the way it works. There is endless learning. And even after 20 years, there's plenty to learn. Roger, the host, has been keeping bees 60 years. I think it'll be the first to agree that there's still more to learn. Just always be curious and inquisitive. Nearly there. This is an example of trying to do away with foundation, and phase 1. Well, essential step 1 is always have the meetings at the pub. So this is 4 different meetings. Top left one is we're trying to replace wax with plastic. In hindsight, I wonder why we did this, but it's a pint of beer and an hour with a colleague, a guy called Frank, and it was a good idea. And then we had trouble fitting them in the sort of frames, so we took away the wood from around the edge of the frame, and in the end we took away the plastic and put the frames back, screwing them together, but then some nails and a bit of glue. So there's a £1.20 bit of foundation list in a frame. This one was 60p because it's a stick with a bit of plastic. This one having to pay for screws and something called cup screws, which is like a fancy shaped washer, and then this one down to 2p. So yeah, 4 pints of beer that took, and 4 weeks to get that far. Now, talked about beekeeping. I like it to be inexpensive, and I like beekeeping to be break even or better. So early doors, if you are fairly new to beekeeping or you want to try something different with your beekeeping, try to find someone that's doing something. The apiary visits for the BBKA during the summer, fantastic for that. BIBBA runs a few summer courses and so on, but as do other people. Don't necessarily jump in yourself. Get some taster sessions, visit other people. When you get going with your beekeeping, it does cost money. Whether you buy a dog or buy a fish tank, if that's your hobby, it costs some money up front. But I'm hoping, rather than have more time, more cost, if you get another hive and another hive, and you buy another nuke and you buy another nuke, you can start to make your own bees and possibly even start to make your own hive. Or rather than buy several nuke boxes, just make sure the 1 or 2 nuke boxes you got are fully used all season round, including the winter. Have a go at raising some nukes, and if you can sell a spare nuke, that brings some income in. You might find at that point your beekeeping is cost neutral that year. If it worked, you might end up selling a couple of nukes next year, and maybe even some honey. and you started to make a slight surplus, hopefully your beekeeping is at least break even. Okay. If you find you're spending lots of money on syrups and Varroa treatments and gadgets and gizmos and snake oil and stuff, then it might just be worth reflecting, is this sustainable? Do I really want to keep spending money? Because I want people to find that beekeeping is free. And if anything, it actually generates a small amount of income and a massive amount of satisfaction for you. Okay. But really, if you've got 4 colonies, then you can get a surplus of bees on a regular basis and probably a surplus of honey to satiate the needs of your family and local family and also newly found friends when you've got some honey available. This is some of my beehives, just made of scaffold planks and pallets. Each hive there, including all the frames, costs around about £20 each. And they're just on some old bits of fencing that I've made into impromptu stands. It's actually 6 there. The 6th one is on the left-hand side, just out of picture. But for me, that's nice and simple, and it works. So there will be a beekeeping journey. Explore, inquire, read up. Be curious and inquisitive early doors. If you can find someone to guide you and mentor you, so much the better. There will be some training to do, some learning, except that when you start your beekeeping, you are what's called unconscious incompetent. You don't know what you don't know. But then when you actually got your bees, you become conscious incompetent, and fear and apprehension and nervousness take over. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you'll become conscious competent and you know how to do it right. And then this last step is a bit like driving, conscious competent. You don't think about which gear you're in and when to change gear and trying to get the bite correctly balanced with releasing the handbrake. It comes naturally after a while, and so will your beekeeping. So become a mentee, do the training, learn how to make more bees, learn how to then improve those bees by selecting the bees that you deem to be the ones most attractive to sort of increase the numbers on. If you can avoid using too many chemicals and feeds and things, it just makes your beekeeping sustainable both for you and for the bees, because you're not mollycoddling them, you're not intervening too much. Come through that journey, and even within 5 years, you could easily be mentoring others. But please share with them just some of the understanding that it is a journey, it's not instant. And the one thing about mentoring is it does raise your beekeeping standards, I think, because you think carefully about what you're going to say and what you do with somebody that is doing it for the very first time. Okay, but we all develop our own way of doing things, so I hope you do too. This is a simple summary of my beehives. The yellow ones are supers. They're actually brew box size because it's utterly simple for me. If you pick the ones in May, I've got a brew box and I put the queen excluder in place and a couple of supers, but I will have taken some frames out in that point, and you can see the nukes down below, 1, 2, and 3, about 3 weeks apart, and that's where I get them from. The winter setup is that I move the queen excluder up and I let the bees have a super of honey for themselves, and I will have probably collected a super of honey as well. Doesn't sound a lot, but because it's a brood box, it tends to be £40 or so. On some of my more productive colonies, I may have to empty that box of honey part of the way through the year and then put it back on and they fill it back up again. It depends on the flow, but I don't have to take supers away. I don't have to worry about different size frames. For me, it's incredibly simple. Do what works for you. It's just brilliant for me. And from a typical hive, I try to get a box of honey, which 20 kilos or £45, and up to 3 nukes. Now, if you were selling the honey, You might think that you can get, let's say, £8 a pound for honey, so it's £300 plus from the honey sales on a hive if you're able to sell all of it. And for a nuke, it's probably almost impossible not to make £100 profit. So it can actually be £600 a colony from a stable colony if you don't want the bees and the honey yourself. Just find out what works for you. Uh, we probably all know the most expensive way to keep bees. Buy it, all the kits, buy your bees, and keep on buying your bees because you don't know how to rear them yourselves. Get lots of top-end equipment, and then you realize you're not looking after it, so you might have to buy some more of it, or you don't know how it works properly. If you only have one colony and it's marginal, you're not going to get a lot for your bees. You need one bee suit, one hive tool, one smoker to look after one colony. You also need the same number of bee suits and smokers and hive tools to look after 50 colonies. So you actually spread the cost the more colonies you get. Uh, I do have lots of unused kit. I've tried it and didn't like it, or I just moved on to something else. I had a fetish about trying different hive tools, and then I realised that the cheap £1.51 was the one for me in the end. I've probably got a museum of different hive tools that have been created over the last 20 years. Great to attend training courses and conferences, and some are unpaid or very low cost, sorry, uncharged and very low cost. Others can be quite expensive. I think the biggest sin is to learn something and then don't do it. Uh, it's it's just such a wasted opportunity. But yes, like I said, inspecting your bees too frequently will cost your bees a jar of honey each time round, and it may be pointless. Was it really needed? You'll only really find out afterwards. But once you've found out, just have that learning and try to apply it next time. Okay, and we've talked about the gadgets and gizmos and treatments, and uh, talk about let your bees suffer unnecessarily. If you over manage them, they suffer unnecessarily. The converse is if you completely undermanage them, they will suffer unnecessarily. Either way, either end of the spectrum is not really sustainable. There's a balance, a sort of balance beekeeping in the middle, and it's up to you to find that with your bees. And the final one on the list, if you're greedy and take all the honey away from the bees, all you then do is throw in some sugar syrup and let them live on the equivalent of Mars bars for winter. It's never going to do you any good. One of my apiaries, again, sort of combination of scaffold plank hives. The bees, the hives in the middle, in sort of a U shape. There's a three and a three, and there's a three hidden at the back. That's where I do quite a lot of my grafting from. And then the bees around the outside, there's normally sort of 15 or so hives of the colonies that I'm making. I'm actually putting another 25 colonies into that apiary because I'm too enthusiastic. Getting near the end, how much time to keep your bees? Well, a lot of time early doors. I think in year one, you might spend 60 hours per hive per year. And that's because you don't know what you're doing, you're not sure, you do it too many inspections, and you just stare, really. Uh, just be mindful that the bees don't appreciate the box being open for too long. But as time goes on, you might find that the amount of interventions you do and the time per intervention go down and down and down. I've been lucky enough to look at lots of hives, and I've averaged it out now. It's about 6 hours per hive per year. And that's to do the inspections, disease monitoring, swarm management, hive maintenance, get the honey off, and play around with supering up and down. Uh, but that just comes with practice. I'm not saying that's good, and I'm not there to impress you, but I just want you to realize that over time it becomes more efficient and more effective with your time with the bees, and so it's sort of more economical in terms of time for you. And that's me. Okay, I hope that's okay. I'll stop the share and happy to answer any simple questions.
Oh, thanks very much, Carl. That was pretty comprehensive.
Well, thank you.
Um, what you don't know is that I've had the benefit of looking at the list of people that have been watching you. and you'd be interested to know that firstly, they haven't dropped off very much. Secondly, there are a lot of beekeepers here that I recognise have been keeping bees 50 years or more. So you'll take that as a compliment. But one thing which
Thank you.
is a problem when you're talking to people of the sort of target audience that you've aimed at is the different conditions. Now, I'm looking at the list here, and
Mm,
I know there's somebody right on the North Scottish coast who could probably see Orkney from where they are. There are beekeepers from East Anglia, Kent, um, Cornwall spotted, Wales, and even Ireland. So basically, what you're saying is it's likely to vary a little bit depending on local conditions. So perhaps you could say just a tiny bit about that whatever you pick up, you need to modify it to suit your own conditions.
yeah, in the magazines and books, it'll give you a time of year to do things. I think America is a good one because there's a massive difference in the different sort of climate in the different regions. But in the UK, we've got exactly the same. It tends to be warmer and for longer down in the south, and it tends to be drier in the east. It's not as simple as that, but local adaptation of bees will suit the local conditions. And the conditions are partly to do with temperature, but also partly to do with rainfall and partly to do with forage availability. Even in a very local area, I live in Cheshire, which has got nice flat plains, but it quickly goes onto the edge of the Pennines and it tips up to 1100 feet and beyond, and it's bleak up there. I could have bees up a mountain that would really struggle, and 2 miles away down at the valley, they find it just blissful. So your local bees that are able to survive and thrive in your local area are probably highly valuable, but don't expect somebody else that's somewhere else to be able to sell you bees or give you bees, and they are equally doing so well in your area. You'll have to learn that along the way. So, yeah, the further north you go, just realize that your season is shorter, and you may not be able to raise too many colonies if that's your thing. But yeah, I've been up near Orkney. I've spent time on Papa Westray. I believe there was an island up there. They used to keep chickens until the storm came through and blew all the chickens off the island completely. So yeah, goodness only knows how the bees would survive.
Right, we've got a few questions in. Um, so I'll run through them. About doing all the qualifications. I don't want to. I want to learn everything though. That's possible, but what's minimal exposure possible to have enough experience? Um, which is a piece of string answer, really, isn't it? But
Yeah.
I see where they're coming from because you need to know quite a lot, don't you? Certainly the basic level.
Have different experiences with your bees, but if you're not learning from those experiences, then you're only bound to repeat them. So if you have a traumatic experience and you don't understand why, then it will repeat over and over again. There are two ways to learn. One is by practical hands-on, and the other one is by reading or going on courses. Both of them have their benefits, but neither one um, is necessarily in isolation the best route to go. I don't personally uh, prefer to go on courses, but there are some that I absolutely would go on again and again. The disease recognition courses, absolutely, because I don't often see the diseases for 5 years or more, so it's good to remind and refresh myself. In terms of books and reading, I've read over 550 books. Actually, I've written one here, the first 5 years of beekeeping. The only downside is it's not finished yet, but so it will be available soonish. But my favorite lots of books are the ones written between the sort of 1850s up to about the 1920s, when beekeeping was what I call the craft of beekeeping. It was real, it was authentic, loads of observation and loads of just thinking logically and laterally, if you like, about what's going on and problem solving on the fly. Yeah. So it it will be down to your personal preferences, how you learn best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This one takes us right back almost to the beginning. I notice your entrance is quite small. What size do you recommend?
As small as you dare. That's that's simple as
Right.
that.
Ah.
I will be writing an article for the BBKA in August or September about entrances. I've thought about this a lot, and there is a particular size or sizes of entrances, both in the height of the entrance, the width of the entrance, but also the depth of the entrance. Uh, I've kept small entrances all the way through. The worst I see is a gaggle of bees queuing to get in, and sometimes out. I actually got the idea from when I travelled down from Cheshire to Euston Station, watching 1,200 people get off the train, and there's 13 platforms there or so, and watching thousands of people come off the train and going down a single escalator to get onto the tube. They all managed to get down, but it looks like it's completely overcrowded and it's illogical. The bigger you make your entrance, the more easy it is for wasps and so on to get in. So
Yeah.
for me, it's just a balance. I would rather the entrance was overcrowded than enabled a wasp to sneak in and then get a message back to the other wasps that it's tally ho.
Does Carl find that many of his frames break because they're supported by fishing nylon, barbecue sticks, and bees make their own comb?
Um, no,
I assume
yeah,
that's
yeah,
probably with extracting that the question was asked on.
yeah. There's right. So bearing in mind that I'm extracting brood frame size frames, so if they're going to break, that's where they break. A freshly drawn out comb is fragile. So over time, they get a bit more rigid. If the comb is drawn out and it's gone right onto the edge of the frame, it makes a pretty good seal. I use the two cocktail sticks method. They're a penny each from Tesco. You buy them, yeah, 100 for £1, so that works for me. But I did experiment with having unwired and uncocktail sticked frames completely. And rather than wire up 10,000 frames, I thought I would just put a wire mesh in my extractor. So my extractor had 1 centimeter square mesh, and the frames were perfectly supported on those. So it depends what you want to do. Uh, if you use a radial extractor, and it's one of these new electronic gizmos that slowly cycle up the speed and then cycle down, they are a lot gentler and kinder on the comb. But if you're using a tangential extractor and sort of thumping it through and it's vibrating all over the place, knocking around the kitchen floor and almost going over sideways, then you're being pretty tough on the foundation.
Well, you've got to
I
keep, yeah, you've got to keep turning them over. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So do one a little bit, turn it over, do it a good bit, and then turn it over again, do the final dregs. Um, I don't have a problem with frames collapsing, and I do a lot of extracting, actually high side, believe it or not. So I have to get it right, otherwise it just becomes a mess right when the bees are next to me.
Um, Another question come in about the same thing. Does Carl mean barbecue sticks rather than cocktail sticks?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah. The longer
Oh,
barbecue sticks. I beg your pardon. Yeah.
okay. Right, we'll just take another couple and then we'll close it. Coming to my fourth spring and summer this year with 12 hives in my back garden. I need an out apiary. How do I find local farmers? Well, I suppose that would depend on the area, but
Yeah. If I can talk about what I've experienced in Cheshire, Lancashire, Staffordshire, and Kent when I wanted to engage with farmers, they all have a local farmers union and they tend to meet. And they might meet in 20 or 30. In Cheshire, they got two groups, North and South Cheshire. And when they meet, sometimes I give a talk to them about the benefits of bees. I talk about pollination, increased crop yields, and you might find 10 or 15 farmers are happy to have some bees on your land. Uh, I do offer them a peppercorn rent a sort of jar of honey per hive per year is a nice simple one. You might want to do a pound of
Yeah.
honey, whatever currency, but that works well. If you talk to them about the benefits of pollination on some of the crops, they love it. So even on oilseed rape, the bees are out there increasing the pollination, which increases the yield, which they see as a mutually beneficial thing. One of the things that is important is the farmers are somewhat compelled to use pesticides and insecticides because it's a competitive world and they've got few choices. And they can work with you to say, I'm going to be spraying my bees on a certain day. And I've got farmers I work with. I stuff some grass in the entrances, and they spray the next day. The bees chew their way through the grass over the next couple of days or so. I hope. I don't often go back, but what happens is the pesticide has done its job. It's dried out. The bees come out, and they tend to be all okay. So there are farmers that really don't mind you being on their land. It's another set of eyes, and if anything, it also makes you a stakeholder in the sort of security of the general farmland and tenure going on. But work with the farmer and give them some honey. Also tell them what's happening. They absolutely love it because they're used to managing livestock themselves, so they appreciate the ups and downs.
All right, Carl, we'll take this as the last one. Um, what would you suggest as the best method of transferring a new nuke of bees to your first hive? I'm assuming this is a new beekeeper who has bought a nuke and they want to move it up.
Okay. There's always a few methods, but your nuke will be growing in size, I hope, and settle down and just leave it in position for a few days. You've got to be mindful about not keeping your bees in a nuke for too long because the population starts to explode. And if it goes overcrowded, they'll want to swarm. So there'll come a point where you want to put it into a brew box. For me, the most important point is that the nuke should be in the place where your brew box is going to be. So just have it there, and then at one point it can be during the daytime. If you want to do it during the evenings, and that's fine. But I tend to do it during nice warm flying weather because lots of the bees are out. But I just swap the frames across in exactly the same sequence and put them into the middle of a brew box, and then have some either frames and foundation, or if you've got drawn comb, so much the better. But that's almost like gold dust early doors. But the bees will settle in very quickly. The returning bees will come back expecting the entrance to be in a certain position, and it is. It's just a new entrance. They'll recognize the sort of pheromones and smells and very quickly adapt to it. I don't have major problems with transferring bees across as long as I'm mindful that the entrance for the nuke is in exactly the same spot as the entrance to the brew box when I do the transfer.
Okay, well, thanks very much,
Yeah.
Carl. You've been over an hour and a half, so
Oh, sorry.
thanks very
Yeah.
much. No, don't worry about that because you can't teach people if you don't tell them, can you? Or show them. So on behalf of all those watching, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you very much.
And
Cheers.
good night, everybody.
Yep. Yep. Bye.